I was refinishing the baseboards in the guest room the afternoon I found the folder. It was a Tuesday, and I remember that specifically because Tuesdays are the day I do the receipts, sitting cross-legged on the office floor with a cup of coffee that always goes cold before I finish it. I wasn't looking for anything unusual that day. I was looking for a drop cloth in the hall closet where my husband keeps his old tax boxes, and my hand landed on a manila folder tucked behind a shoebox of receipts, labeled in his handwriting, Whitmore Holdings, do not file. 12 years as a forensic accountant teaches you what an innocent folder looks like. An innocent folder sits in plain view. An innocent folder does not have a warning written across the tab in your own husband's handwriting. This one did not look innocent, and everything in my training told me to close it and walk away, and everything in my marriage told me I already knew I wasn't going to. Inside were 3 wire transfer confirmations, each for a little under $10,000, moved out of an account I did not recognize into an LLC I had never heard of. Just under $10,000 every time, which told me something on its own. Someone had structured those transfers deliberately to stay below the threshold that triggers automatic bank reporting. My name was listed on 2 of the 3 transfers, not as the sender, as the authorized signer. My hands did not shake, which surprised me even in the moment, the way you sometimes notice your own calm from a slight distance, almost like watching someone else manage it. I sat on the closet floor for a long time. I did not cry. I did not call him at the office and demand an explanation, the way I imagine most people would have. I photographed every page with my phone, careful to capture the corners and the staple marks so nothing would look disturbed later, returned the folder to the exact spot I had found it, corner turned down at the same angle it had been, and went back to the baseboards like nothing in the house had changed. Because as far as anyone else needed to know that afternoon, nothing had. I painted trim for another hour with my hands perfectly steady, and somewhere underneath that steadiness, a version of my life I had spent a decade building was already quietly ending, though I did not let myself think that thought all the way through yet. My name is Elena Cross. I am 36 years old, and I have spent my entire adult career finding the one small inconsistency that unravels a much larger lie. Companies hire me when their internal numbers do not add up and they need someone patient enough and stubborn enough to find out why. I have a reputation in my field for being the calmest person in rooms where nobody else is calm. CFOs sweating through board meetings, business owners insisting their books are fine, right up until I show them the line item that proves otherwise. My father, who ran a small hardware store his whole life and did his own books until the day he died, used to say I had the kind of mind that could not leave a wrong number alone, and he meant it as the highest compliment he knew how to give. I believed, for most of my adult life, that if you did the work honestly and kept your own house clean, the people who loved you would do the same in return. That belief did not survive that Tuesday afternoon, though it would take me several more weeks to understand exactly how far it had already been broken. I met Thomas 11 years ago at a fundraising gala I was auditing for a children's literacy nonprofit board. He was already a rising name in commercial real estate development, the kind of man who walked into a room and immediately knew which 3 people in it mattered most that night. He was charming in the specific way that men who are used to being trusted are charming, quick with a compliment, quicker with a joke that made you feel, just for a moment, like the only interesting person in the building. I gave up an associate position at a well-regarded firm in the city 2 years into our marriage and moved closer to where his projects were breaking ground. And I told myself for a long time that this was a partnership, that his career simply needed proximity in a way mine did not, and that mine could travel with me anywhere. I built a small independent practice out of our home office instead, took on clients by referral, and for years I told myself that had been my choice, and not a quiet concession I had made without ever quite admitting it to myself. There were good years in there, real ones, not the kind you invent later to make a marriage sound better than it was. But there were also years where I noticed things and chose, deliberately, not to examine them too closely, because looking closely at your own husband takes a kind of clinical distance that felt like a betrayal of its own. A credit card statement he once asked me not to open, because he said it would spoil a surprise he was planning, and there was, eventually, a surprise, so I let that one go. A business trip to Denver that quietly stretched from 3 days to 7 with an explanation about permits that never quite added up when I thought about it later. A late-night phone call he took standing in the garage with the door pulled shut behind him, his voice low in a register I didn't recognize. I filed all of it away the way I file anomalies in other people's ledgers when I'm not yet sure they mean anything, telling myself I would return to them eventually, and then, mostly, I did not. Because loving someone and quietly auditing him at the same time is an exhausting thing to sustain for very long. I remember one dinner, maybe 4 years into the marriage, when his mother made an offhand comment about how Thomas used to be different with money in his 20s, and the whole table moved past it so quickly that I assumed it was nothing, some minor embarrassment about student loans or a repossessed car, the kind of thing every family has tucked somewhere in its past. Thomas laughed it off with a joke about his father's old Buick, and everyone laughed with him, and I laughed too, because that is what you do at a dinner table when you love the people sitting at it. I did not think about that comment again for 7 years. When I finally did think about it again, I understood it had been the one honest sentence spoken at that entire table, and every single person at it, except me, had known exactly what it meant. His business partner, Nathan Reyes, was the person who made our life together feel warm in a way that had nothing to do with either of us directly. Nathan was at every holiday, every summer barbecue, the honorary uncle figure to nobody's actual children, since neither couple had any yet. He remembered my birthday before Thomas did, more than 1 year running. He was generous with praise in a way that felt effortless, and quick to take my side in the small disagreements that happen at every dinner table, and I loved him for all of it, the way you come to love the people who make a marriage feel less isolated than it sometimes is. Admiration and envy wear the same face sometimes, and it would be a long while yet before I understood which one Nathan had actually been wearing whenever he looked at my husband across a room. 3 weeks after I found the folder, I finally understood the full shape of what I was looking at. The account those wire transfers had come from was not a business account at all, the way I had first assumed. It was a home equity line drawn against our house, one I had co-signed years earlier in a stack of closing paperwork, trusting the man who handed me the pen, rather than reading every page the way I would have for a client. $91,000, in total, had moved out of that line of credit over the previous 14 months, routed each time through Whitmore Holdings, an LLC registered to an address that turned out, when I drove past it on a lunch break, to be a private mailbox store 2 towns over, tucked between a nail salon and a tax preparation office that felt almost like a joke at my expense. My own signature, or something close enough to pass a teller's glance, sat on 2 authorization forms for transactions I had never made, never seen, and never once been told about. I did not confront him that night, or the next one, or the one after that. My rule, the one I use in every investigation I have ever run for a client, is that you gather everything before the other party knows you have seen any of it. People who genuinely believe they will never get caught do not cover their tracks carefully, because covering tracks well takes exactly the kind of fear that guilty people who still feel safe simply do not carry yet. I opened a private email account under a name he would never think to search for. I requested certified copies of the loan documents from our bank under the cover of a routine annual mortgage review, the kind I actually do run for clients every year, so the request would not raise a single flag. I began keeping a log, dated and time-stamped down to the hour, exactly the way I would for any client sitting across the desk from me asking whether their spouse was stealing from them. The deeper I went, the messier his trail became, exactly the way it always does with people who mistake confidence for safety. The LLC had been formed using a notary stamp registered to an office Thomas's own firm used regularly for closings, which meant someone inside his company, someone with access to that stamp, had helped him set the entire structure up. The withdrawals clustered around the same handful of dates each month, dates that lined up, almost too neatly to be coincidence, with a pattern I recognized instantly from 12 years of reading other people's financial lives for a living, recurring payments to a private membership platform that runs high-stakes, invitation-only poker out of a licensed operation registered in Curacao. My husband was not funding some secret second business the way I had first, almost hopefully, assumed. He was feeding a habit he had never once mentioned to me in 11 years of marriage, and he had been doing it with money that carried my name and my legal exposure attached to every dollar of the risk. I spent one full weekend building what I privately called the timeline, the same document I hand every client at the end of an engagement, a single spreadsheet with every transaction, every date, every counterparty, laid out in chronological order until the pattern becomes impossible to unsee. I cross-referenced the withdrawal dates against Thomas's calendar, which he had shared with me years earlier for scheduling reasons and never thought to revoke. Every single spike matched a weekend he had logged as a site inspection trip 3 counties over, places where, as far as I could tell from the mileage on his car and the hotel folios I eventually pulled, no actual site inspection had ever taken place. I found 4 hotel charges at properties with no active listings in his portfolio anywhere near them. I found a pattern of ATM withdrawals in cities where he had no meetings on the books at all. Once you know how to look for the shape of a lie, it stops looking like anything else. I thought, for a few days, that I had finally found the whole story, and that the worst of it was behind me now that I understood it. I was wrong, and the moment I realized how wrong reshaped everything else I thought I had understood about my own marriage. Buried further back in the loan file was a second signature I had not expected to see anywhere in this, notarized 8 full months before the very first withdrawal had gone out, his mother's. Diane Cross had quietly co-signed a private letter of guarantee to the bank, backstopping the entire line of credit against her own retirement account, in case the balance ever came due and Thomas could not cover it himself. She had known, not recently, not vaguely. She had known before any of this had even started, and she had made arrangements for it in advance. I called her 2 days later and asked her, as calmly as I have ever asked anyone anything in my life, to simply tell me the truth. She went quiet on the phone for long enough that I genuinely thought the call had dropped. And then she told me the part of the story that reframed everything I believed I understood about the man I had married. Thomas had developed a gambling problem in his early 20s, years before I ever walked into his life, one severe enough that his father had once threatened, in front of the whole family, to cut him out of the business entirely over it. Diane had made a private promise to her husband back then, and later renewed it silently to herself, that she would never let their son's old shame become public again. Not to a wife, not to a business partner, not to anyone outside their own four walls. She had been quietly covering for him for well over a decade by that point, moving smaller amounts through her own accounts whenever his debts spiked and threatened to surface, and she had let me believe, for 11 straight years, that the man I married had no real history worth worrying about at all. She confirmed every word of it in writing 2 days later, in a signed statement her own attorney notarized on her behalf, because she said, quietly, that she was finally done being the only person left carrying it alone. I asked Priya to independently verify the guarantee letter and the retirement account records before I let myself fully believe any of it, because 12 years in my profession has taught me never to accept a confession at face value, no matter how sincerely it is delivered. Priya came back 3 days later with the bank's own file, the original notarized guarantee dated 8 months before the first withdrawal, exactly as Diane had described it, along with a second document neither of us had expected. A letter from a family counselor Richard and Diane had seen privately, 20 years earlier, the year Thomas turned 23, recommending residential treatment for a gambling disorder that the family had ultimately declined to pursue. The paper trail did not just confirm what Diane told me. It went back further than even she had admitted, into a decision the family had made 2 decades before I ever entered any of their lives, to manage the problem quietly rather than treat it honestly. The confrontation I had been dreading for weeks ended up happening entirely without me in the room. It happened on Thanksgiving, at his parents' house, in front of 12 members of a family that has always prided itself, publicly, on its composure. My sister-in-law called me that same night and told me exactly what she had seen, because she said someone in that family needed to finally say it plainly out loud, and she did not trust anyone else in that house to be the one to do it. Nathan had cornered Thomas in the kitchen over a missing partnership distribution, $120,000 that should have landed in the firm's operating account months earlier and never had. Nathan's voice never rose once, she told me, which somehow made the entire scene worse than shouting would have. He asked a single question, evenly, directly, with Thomas's own father standing 3 feet away. Where did the Whitmore transfers actually go? My sister-in-law said the color left Thomas's face the way water leaves a sink all at once, and that Richard Cross set his fork down slowly and did not pick it back up again for the rest of the meal. Nobody finished dinner that night. Nobody in that dining room pretended, after that single question, that everything in the family was still fine. I met Thomas 2 nights later, in the home office where I do all of my work, seated in a chair I had chosen deliberately, and at a time I had chosen just as deliberately, because I have spent an entire career learning how much the setting of a conversation changes what a person believes they are allowed to say inside it. He tried, at first, to make the whole thing sound small. A rough patch, a mistake he had already started quietly fixing on his own, a plan he claimed he'd had all along, to pay everything back in full, before I ever noticed a thing. He told me he loved me and asked for the kind of second chance most people only ask for after they've been caught rather than before, in the moment they were actually sorry. I let him finish every word of it without interrupting. Then I told him, evenly, that understanding why a person lies to you is not the same thing as agreeing to keep living inside that lie indefinitely, and that I had spent my entire professional life teaching other people the exact difference between a reasonable excuse and an account that genuinely balances. His did not balance, not by a wide margin, and I said so without raising my voice a single time. Before any of that, I sat across from my attorney, a sharp, unhurried woman named Priya Anand who has built her entire practice around exactly this kind of quiet unraveling, and I laid the whole timeline out on her desk, the way I would for any client of my own. She read through it twice without saying a word, then looked up at me and asked only one question. Did I want to punish him, or did I want to be finished with him? Because she said those two goals require completely different strategies, and most people who walk into her office cannot yet tell the difference between them. I told her I wanted to be finished, cleanly, with everything accounted for and nothing left owed on either side. She nodded, like that was the answer she had been hoping to hear, and from that afternoon forward, every decision we made was built around precision instead of anger. The legal process that followed was deliberate, and it was not vindictive, because I had decided early on that I did not want it to be. I retained a family attorney and a forensic partner from outside my own firm to keep the entire process clean and above reproach, and within 4 months we had reached a settlement that reflected the honest truth of what had happened, rather than a fight over who could hurt the other one more efficiently on the way out. I kept the house outright, since the equity line at the center of everything had been drawn against an asset I had personally paid into for over a decade of my own income. Thomas retained his stake in the firm, on the explicit condition that Nathan and an independent outside auditor would oversee every account going forward, indefinitely. Diane offered, more than once, gently and I think sincerely, to help us find a way back to each other. I told her, kindly, but with real finality, that some doors close not out of anger at all, but out of a clarity you cannot unknow once you have it, the way you finish the very last page of a book, whose ending you already understand completely before you get there. It has been a 1.5 years now since that Tuesday in the closet. I sold the small solo practice I had run quietly out of a home office for a decade and opened a proper firm downtown with two other women who each carried their own version of my exact story. One had been a bookkeeper for 6 years, unknowingly laundering money for a spouse who told her their finances were simply too complicated for her to worry about. The other was a nurse whose husband had drained a joint retirement account into a shell company he described to her, convincingly, as a promising medical device startup. We named the firm Clearlight Financial Advocates, and most of our clients arrived the same way I arrived at myself, sitting somewhere on a floor with a folder they were never supposed to find in the first place. We teach people to read the documents nobody around them ever bothers to explain properly, to question the one account they were quietly told not to worry about, and to trust the actual number in front of them over whatever comfortable story someone else has been telling them about that number for years. Just last month, a woman sat in the same chair Priya once offered me and told me she had found a second mortgage on a house she thought had been paid off years earlier, taken out through a signature she was almost certain was not entirely her own. I recognized the exact look on her face, the specific stillness people have right before they decide whether to fall apart or start taking notes. I handed her a legal pad and a pen the way someone once should have handed one to me, and I told her the only rule that has ever actually mattered in this work. Gather everything first, and let the documents do the talking. Because documents, unlike people, do not know how to lie convincingly forever. I think about Diane sometimes, more than I expected I would, and I find that I do not actually hate her, even though I understand now that her silence protected her son at the direct and prolonged cost of my own years. I think the real lesson in all of it was never really about Thomas specifically, or the money specifically, or even the folder itself. It is that the people who love us most can still decide, quietly, with what they genuinely believe are the very best intentions in the world, that we do not deserve the whole truth about our own lives. I decided, somewhere in the middle of all of it, that I would rather have every ugly piece of the full truth than keep living comfortably inside someone else's carefully edited version of it. So that is where I am now, a year and a half out from that Tuesday, running a firm that exists directly because of the worst single discovery I ever made in my life. I genuinely do not know exactly how Thomas is doing these days, only what filters back to me occasionally through people who still speak to both of us out of old habit, and some part of me remains honestly, quietly curious how the rest of his story turns out, now that nobody left in his life is willing to keep covering for him anymore. If you had been the one sitting in that closet with me that Tuesday afternoon, tell me honestly, would you have confronted him that same night, or would you have done exactly what I did and gathered every last piece of it first, before saying a single word? Let me know in the comments where you're watching this from tonight, because I read every single one of them. And if you want more stories like this one, quiet women who found their way all the way back to themselves, go ahead and hit that subscribe button, because there is another story coming very soon.